When most people think about Irish plantations, they think of a deliberate colonial project. The English had a plan: move loyal Protestant settlers in, push native Irish out, and civilise the island. Brutal, yes, but intentional. But I have a problem with that. It gets some of the thinking very wrong. Every time England carried out a major Irish campaign, they faced the same cash crisis. Munster in the 1580s, Ulster in 1610, the Cromwellian request in the 1650s. The pattern was always the same: fight an expensive war, win it, and then have no money left to pay the army that won it. So in March 1642, Parliament looked to solve this forever. They passed what's called the Adventurers Act, a scheme where private investors put up money to fund the reconquest of Ireland, which had just rebelled against English rule. And the money these investors were putting in wasn't repaid in cash, but in confiscated Irish land. Because there was no cash left to offer. By the 1650s, the Cromwellian request had cost somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million. On top of that, the army was still owed 1.75 million in back pay. The Treasury had nothing left to give. But this wasn't exactly a new problem. A century earlier, Sir Henry Sidney was already pushing for plantations, conducted at sundry men's charges, without exhausting of the prince's particular purse. So the economic logic was baked in from the start. The stated answer across every wave was the same: we cannot pay in cash, we will pay in land. Land was the way out. The soldier was the instrument. Ireland was the ledger. Every wave of plantation from the 1580s to the 1650s followed the same logic. Turn what England owed its soldiers into land in Ireland, because the cash simply wasn't there. And that pattern almost explains everything that comes after. But not really, because we need to understand why it failed so consistently. Why did they have to keep going back? Why did they keep getting into more debt? And why did they have to keep offering more and more land to people? So let's dig deeper into what these soldiers were actually being given. The Cromwellian settlement is the clearest example of the mechanics in action, because the paperwork survived. We know exactly how it worked. And when you walk through it step by step, what initially looks like a colonisation program starts to look a lot more like a financial plan that got out of hand. Here's what actually happened when a soldier was discharged from Cromwell's army. Parliament owed a serious amount of money to two specific groups when it came to Ireland, and it set aside 10 Irish counties specifically to pay off the two groups. Those are the adventurers, the private investors from 1642 who were still owed their returns, and the soldiers who were still owed their wages. Each soldier received something called a debenture, a document that stated exactly how much money the state owed them for their service since 1649. Not cash, an IOU. That debenture could be swapped for land through a lottery as regiments were disbanded. Soldiers drew lots for their allocations, but that led to more problems. Problem 1, the amount of land available turned out to be less than expected. So the rate, how many acres per pound owed, was revised downward as the process went on. Soldiers got less than they'd been told. Problem 2, and this is the number that tells the whole story, 33,419 debentures were issued. Only 11,804 were ever exchanged for actual land. What happened to the other 21,000? Most ordinary soldiers sold their debentures almost immediately for whatever cash they could get, often to their own officers or to speculators, already moving through the camps, buying up paper before the soldiers had a chance to decide if they should sell or not. And the reason they were selling was simple. A small plot of unfamiliar Irish land, often less than 100 acres, wasn't much of a prize. A soldier with a debenture worth £50 could sell it for £30 cash, and that £30 was real and spendable now. The land was far away and uncertain. So a market to trade Irish land was already operating before most of the land had even been formally handed out. By 1670, roughly 15 years after the settlement, only 7,500 soldiers were still on their grants. Quiz here: 33,000 debentures, 7,500 settlers. That's a 77% dropout rate. 3/4 of the people this system was supposedly settling Ireland with were gone within a generation. The debenture system didn't produce a settler class, it produced a speculator class. The soldiers who stayed weren't necessarily the best equipped to develop the land. They were often the ones with nowhere else to go, or officers wealthy enough to buy out their men and build up large holdings. The land was already piling up in fewer and fewer hands before the first crops were even planted. And here's another thing, even the soldiers who did stay faced a problem the system had no answer for. They had land, they had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Let's put ourselves in the position of one of these soldiers for a minute, one who stayed. You have land in, say, Tipperary or Kilkenny. You're an English infantryman. You have no farming knowledge, no local connections, no money to develop the estate, and you're surrounded by a displaced Irish population that has every reason to want you gone. The official rules attached to your grant say you must bring in English Protestant settlers, build up the land, and keep native Irish tenants off it. That is what you are legally supposed to do anyway. So what do you actually do? And as we now know, the same problem played out in every earlier wave of plantation, which tells you it wasn't an accident or a one-off, and not just a Cromwellian failure, although Cromwell has a lot to answer for. Munster in the 1580s, grants of 4,000 to 12,000 acres, with conditions requiring large numbers of English settler families per grant. Most grantees either walked away or sold their interests within a generation. George Stone and John Champion are some specific names we know who did fail. Grantees were required to settle able-bodied British men on their land and keep native Irish tenants out. They failed, not necessarily because they were incompetent, but because native Irish tenants were already there, already knew how to work the land, and would pay rent straight away. Bringing in British settlers was slow, expensive, and uncertain. The logical move every single time across every single wave was keep the Irish tenants, take the rent, and either stay in England or move to Dublin. In 1622, a survey of the earlier Midlands plantations found that most grantees preferred to collect their rents through agents rather than live on their estates. This was 60 years before the Cromwellian settlement, and that pattern will repeat again. As for Cromwell's soldiers specifically, the new model army had recruited widely. Many of these men had no experience running estates, no background in farming, no knowledge of how to manage land in a country they'd only ever known as a war zone. Many of them were peasants themselves. So Cromwell and his government's vision of Ireland thoroughly settled by a veteran class of soldiers and farmers, the stated goal, never happened. The absentee landlord wasn't necessarily a corruption of the plantation system, it was probably the most logical endpoint of it. Everyone's incentives pointed in the same direction. Take the rent, stay away, get an agent to handle it. And the Irish tenant at the bottom of this arrangement. Kept on the land not as a beneficiary of any plan, but because they were the only one who actually knew how to make it produce anything. But they had no leverage and no way out. They were the one who made the numbers work, but not for themselves, for someone else's debt. But to see how deep it went, look at what happened when the landlords themselves ran into debt. And so even though these landlords were often exploiting Irish people, they themselves were no better off being part of the system. And we can see that from what happened when they ran into debt. The soldier turned landlord was often not the end of the chain, but he was the one crucial link in it. From Irish to English, it kept changing hands. And every time it did, the financial pressure on the new owner was at least as bad as it had been on the previous one. Look at what happened in Ulster. Not to the ordinary soldiers, but to the larger grantees, the men who were supposed to be the success stories of the plantation system. So Robert McClelland, this isn't him because we don't have pictures of many of these people, took over the haberdashers' proportion in Ulster after the original company, one of the London guilds meant to develop the county of Londonderry, failed to meet its obligations. McClelland was heavily in debt to Scottish moneylenders. He used his Irish land as security for those debts. He eventually left the estate to his nephew, but it wasn't intended as a clean inheritance. It was to settle the debts he owed. So William Stewart bought land from a failing grantee named Edward Kingswell, but had already missed his plantation conditions. Stewart's new property came preloaded with the financial wreckage of the previous owner, and they weren't exceptions. They're pretty standard for this era. Each time land changed hands, the debts of the previous owner came with it. The new owner needed to come up with more income, so more rent, to cover those debts, which meant higher charges, shorter leases, less security for the tenant, and none of these owners had any reason to invest in improving the land. Investment required money they didn't really have, and security they couldn't guarantee, because their own hold on the estate was shaky at best. So the landlord needed rent to pay his debts. The tenant needed security to invest in the land. Neither could give the other what they needed. And England, the country that had created this problem, had no way, or more accurately no desire, to resolve it cleanly. The remaining landlords were now focused on extracting as much money out of Ireland as they possibly could. They weren't just created by one bad decision or just one bad person. It was the output of a chain. State cash crisis, land as debt settlement, soldiers as reluctant landlords, debentures sold to speculators, speculators indebted to moneylenders, Irish tenants paying for all of it. And this whole thing was a trap for everyone involved. But the effects of this didn't just stay contained to the 17th century where they mostly began. Let's skip forward a few hundred years. It's the 1870s and 1880s. Tenant farmers across Ireland are organising, withholding rents and demanding what they called 3 Fs: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. This is what's known as the Land War, one of the biggest political movements in European history. The complaints sound like they belong to the time the people are living through, and they are relevant, but the structure being fought over was set in the 17th century. The landlord class these tenants were fighting in 1880 were the direct descendants of the Cromwellian plantation system from the 1650s. The land had passed through generations of debt, sale, mortgage, and inheritance, but the extractive relationship between the absent owner and rent-paying tenant had never really been structurally changed. Why not? Because reform probably meant buying out the landlords. And the landlords, many of them deeply in debt themselves, couldn't accept anything less than full market value for land they were using as collateral for their debts. England, the state that created the problem in the 1650s by using land to pay off its army, 200 years later produced a landlord class that could only be removed if the state paid out again. Multiple reform attempts failed for this exact reason. William Gladstone's Land Acts of 1870 and 1881 improved conditions for tenants, but couldn't break the underlying deadlock. The Wyndham Land Act of 1903 eventually did it, a large state-funded land purchase scheme that transferred ownership from landlords to tenants at scale, and it worked. The landlord class was effectively dissolved, gone. But it took 250 years, and in the meantime, a famine that killed 1 million people, a land war, and multiple failed reforms to get there. The reason it took so long, something that you're going to be bored of me saying if you watch all of my videos, the system, like many colonial systems, had no internal correction mechanism. Every person inside it was trapped by the logic of the layer above them. And so here's the thing that gets missed when the plantation system is framed as a colonial civilizing project. Civilizing projects, often very brutal, at least have the idea of eventually improving the lives of the people that they say they're helping. You can point to a destination that you're all heading to, although obviously it's self-serving in reality. A debt settlement scheme contains no logic like that. It was built to transfer the debt to somebody else. The soldier who couldn't go home became a landlord who wouldn't stay. The absentee who extracted became a creditor's asset. And at every stage, the Irish tenant was the one who made the numbers work. Not because they were the beneficiary of any plan, just as the mechanism that was used to pay off everyone else's debts. But there is a twist. In my opinion, when people argue about whether the plantation system was primarily about religion or race or empire, they're having an incomplete argument, or maybe even wrong. Because the landlords who extracted the most weren't always English. They weren't always even Protestant. By the 18th century, some of the most aggressive rent gougers in Ireland were Catholic, Anglo-Irish, and deeply embedded in Irish society. All the extracting they were doing wasn't really built on ideology per se. The extraction was just how the system worked. The ideology was partially the story people told about it afterwards. The plantation system didn't only create a class of people who wanted to exploit Ireland. It created a set of financial conditions in which exploitation was one of the only moves that made any sense, regardless of who was holding the deed and who was paying. And that kind of thinking still rules the world to this day. One other thing, it might sound like in this video that I'm saying it wasn't colonialism in Ireland. It definitely was. What I'm saying is it wasn't as though everyone involved got together a plan and said, let's colonialize Ireland. Some people definitely did. But what I'm trying to do is peel back the layers and see how even the people that weren't thinking in that way still took part. And the harm happened regardless of whether they were thinking it was colonial or not. Anyway, bye.